Are you ready?
So, what's happening now is we're going to have another lecture, and then we're going to talk about splitting you into groups to do some project work out on site tomorrow, and go through some tools with you to assess the space of your visits. There's going to be a lot of groups, I think, more than we do, so this is going to be very interesting. Okay. Thank you. So, having thought about the benefits of open spaces, I want to go on to discuss something about the different types of open spaces, because I'm sure in your cities here, as well as in our cities in the UK, you've not got all the same sorts of open spaces. And sometimes it's helpful for us to acknowledge that, to think about that, in the way we plan them, design them, and the way we manage them in particular. And it's been a big issue in our planning processes in our country as well. So I'm going to explain to you how I decided to explain the different types of open spaces when I wrote the book. And I was thinking about it not from a planner's perspective, but from a user's perspective. And when I first started to write this book, I was thinking about the different open spaces we might use through our lifetime. But the reviewer of the book didn't quite like the way I structured it. And I think there are some spaces we use at some parts of life that we might come back to use again when we're older. So it's structured in a particular way. So what we're going to look at is defining open space, and before we come to my typologies of open spaces, we're going to look at how some people have defined open space. And then we're going to touch towards the end of this lecture on public and private space, because as well as there being different types of open space, those spaces might be publicly owned or privately owned. So we'll consider that as well. So, what is open space? Anybody want to give me a definition?
Ma'am, any land surface which does not have roof, it can be paved or unpaved.
Okay, anything that doesn't have a roof, that's a nice, and it can be paved or unpaved. Any other ideas? So we'll first look at the what is open space before we look at the types of them. And there are a whole range of people over the years who have discussed what open spaces are. So somebody called Gold was talking about open spaces, land and water. So that's interesting because we might not necessarily think of that. In an urban area, so only urban, not in a rural area, that's not covered by cars or buildings or has any undeveloped land in the area. Now all of these definitions I'm going to explain and give to you can be criticised. You know, you could say, well, what about open space in rural areas? Surely there might be there. And why is it only if it's not covered by cars? Do they mean roads or buildings? But some of our roads are open spaces as well. They're linear open spaces. And undeveloped land, well, sometimes undeveloped land can provide opportunities for community to be involved in them, for planting to grow naturally and provide habitats for wildlife. So I think this isn't a perfect answer. I don't think any of them are. Tankle talks about it's not only the land or the water, so it's both of those, but it's the space and the light above the land. And I think for many years I really wasn't sure about this. But one of the things that has changed in our country is that we have an increase in wind turbines. These are very big, discrete elements or groups of elements on our landscape. They have an enormous visual impact. I think they're sort of sculptural in a way, but I don't live near one. And some of the people who live near them don't like them. They don't like the hum, the noise, they don't like the physical presence. So I think this definition has some meaning that I've grown to understand more in the last 5 to 10 years. Galen Krantz is in America and has written, open spaces are wide open areas. they can be narrow as well. There's a fluid that they flow into the park, and the park can flow into the city. So that all sounds very nice, very constructive. I think it's more complicated than that, but I think that integration of urban and open space, built form and open space perhaps, is very, has a very positive approach to it. So, in my book, I come round to thinking about domestic open spaces, neighbourhood open spaces, and civic open spaces. And what we'll do is go through those different typologies. So instead of thinking of this is the sort of spaces we use through our lives, these are the different types, almost on a home range, those closest to our homes, then in our neighbourhood, then in our city. Now I think there is some relationship to our life cycle, because I think as children we start using those spaces close to home. As we get older we go further away, and for some older people they move back towards those domestic open spaces perhaps, but not for everybody. So, first of all, under the category of domestic open spaces, I think housing areas and the landscapes in which our housing is set is very important. This is a photograph of the part of Birmingham, which is England's second biggest city, where I was born and spent my childhood years. Some of you may know Cadbury's chocolate. It's Bourneville, right next to the Cadbury's chocolate factory. We used to say our lungs were covered in chocolate. And it was designed and built out of the city centre of Birmingham, so away from the industrialisation that was happening over 100 years ago. And George Cadbury built it partly because he wanted better quality houses, but he also wanted people to have gardens, to grow fruit and vegetables, and for children to play. And he wanted to use the stream for the factory, but also retained some of the parkland areas, so it was a very green city. So the setting of this was very good. This was called a garden village. You'll have heard of garden cities. There were garden villages, just a few of them. Very often built by industrialists who had a religious faith and who wanted to look after their workforce. So some of them were chocolate makers. The one in York was a chocolate maker. Some of them made soap. So Lever Brothers did one. This is a completely different approach. This is in Germany, a much more recent, where the whole of this is looking very green and very different heights of planting. You'll see there's a lot of English grass here, but with beautiful bulbs and trees. Here we've got planting of different heights. So this, where we set our housing and the quality of that landscape is very, very important. Now, as well as where the housing is set, particularly in England, we have lots of gardens. You have some gardens here, and I think Asia's tradition on gardens are not the same as they are in the UK. And gardens are used for growth. Think of all those benefits that we thought about earlier. They provide for many of those. These are some of my children's parties when they were younger, doing all sorts of things. So very, very good spaces, and in the UK people are proud to have gardens, and it's supposed to be a country of gardens. And you can use them in the winter as well. That was when we were trying to have snow one winter. So gardens are right close to where those daily experiences of our lives are, even as very young people. In some parts of the world, those gardens aren't just for one house, but they are shared, so they become community gardens. So there are different types of community gardens. In New York, there was a period of time when buildings had been demolished, and a whole range of people claimed those spaces as community gardens, casita-based gardens. Often they were people who are ethnically diverse, and they used these for growing food, and they were very popular. In other parts of the world, particularly in places like Europe, the gardens were, community gardens are more shared gardens between different houses, but not necessarily houses, more apartment blocks. So you might have a community garden that is shared by a lot of people living around it, and they have this sense of ownership of it. In more modern times, on some of my visits to China, I've seen gated communities. Now, the literature about gated communities out of America is very critical because it's for rich people, but I actually see in China, where you've got sort of like 15,000 people living in a gated community, that what you end up with is a community garden, but it's almost a community park, and it serves a very, very important function. So gardens, community gardens, and we have a lot of these allotments in the UK. These have been very important for growing food. During the World War II, there was an increase in the number of these because we needed to grow more food at home and not import food. And allotments go through trends in the UK, being popular or not. And in our city they're very popular, and you rent them from the local government, and they put the price up a few years ago, and this was a public outroar, that the price had gone up, but it was needed to try and help maintain them. So this is one quite near the university that I go past on my way home, or it's just on a little off-road, and this one has been recently redone. It's very neatly ready to be planted. There's cute little plants and things. They can take all sorts of forms. Sometimes they get overgrown if people neglect them, but they are a really important source of opportunities for growing things, fruits and vegetables, and for meeting other people. There was in one city a time when they were sort of revamping the allotments and called them leisure gardens, and made sure there's a communal area with water and rubbish and a shed to keep your gardening tools in. You see, these don't really have that. There's a little something here, but they were very structured at one time in some of the cities. So very important, and they're domestic because they're sort of partly taking that role of a garden, and they're usually not far from home. You might argue these are neighbourhood spaces, and you know, I'm quite happy if that's how you think of them, because they're sort of in a neighbourhood, not right next to the house. So we'll move on to neighbourhood spaces, and one of the most important ones in the UK are our parks. And a lot of the parks in the industrial towns were given by the people running the industries. So in our city, some of the parks were given by the people running the steel industries, because they understood some of those benefits of open spaces and wanted people to have somewhere to go and relax, to breathe clean air. Think how bad steelworks were 100 years ago, when they were very, very intense, very noisy, very polluted. So these were very important lungs of the city, as Olmsted called green spaces. So in many of our cities they're very important. The cafe is one of the very, very popular places. It gets absolutely full, sometimes the queues out the door. You're not supposed to ride bicycles through the park. There's a bylaw that says you should, but people do, and I think that's fine. I don't think there should be a bylaw there, because actually a park is a safe place for children to learn how to ride a bike. But remember that we talked about different benefits, and one of those is walking. So there's people walking dogs. There's lots of dog walkers in Sheffield, and they walk their dogs at the same time of the day, and they bump into each other, and it would make a really interesting research project, because I'm sure there's a really strong social network amongst those dog walkers. Sometimes parks are used for events, and this is an event that happens in a park in Bristol. It's a balloon festival, which I don't know where the person was who took this photograph, up in another balloon perhaps. Very colourful, but events are very important, because sometimes they bring people to our parks for the first time, and then sometimes they come and use the park more regularly afterwards. And then, because we're in winter here, sledging is a very popular activity when we get snow in the UK. We haven't had a good winter for a few years now. Last winter it was mild and very wet, but it was so mild it fell as rain, not snow. So I'm hoping to go back and see we get some snow, and I like it. Everything goes more people walk home, it dampens down all the sales. And there's something quite pretty about the snow being there. So this is a local park, and the first sign is snow. You can see everybody's out there. Sponges, tea trays, plastic bags sometimes for snow. So parks are a very, very important neighbourhood open space. Now, sometimes embedded within those parks, but sometimes separate from them, are things called playgrounds. But there are people who have talked about the playground shouldn't just be an island in the neighbourhood and isolated from other places that children can play in. And we'll talk something more about that in a later lecture. We're going to spend a whole lecture looking at children's environments. In fact, some people have said that the whole city should be a playground, and I think that's increasingly what I feel, that we should be designing our cities as playful places, not just a playground. But you can see people have been saying it for years. So Colin Ward, who was a writer and social observer in the UK, was very popular, has a lovely book called The Child in the City. Very hard to get hold of because it's out of print. If you ever find one and it's not too expensive, buy it. It's great. It's full of beautiful photographs, including photographs of a place in London where there were skateboarders in 1978, where they are still skating now in the Undercroft on the south bank of the Thames. But other people have also talked about the whole city should be a playground, and I think it's something that we don't think about enough. Roger Hart, who's a geographer at City University of New York, has talked about traditional playgrounds don't provide the entire play opportunity that children require. Somebody in our country called Tim Gill, who ran the Children's Play Council, talks about playful spaces, and as a landscape architect I talk about playful landscapes. I think we should be providing landscapes for play. So, neighbourhood open spaces. We have playgrounds of all different sorts, but, I thought these usually come on with animations. Look at this. Here's one tree. How many children can you count playing on that tree? Well, I'm not sure. There's a lot. It's sort of like 16, 17, 18. More than you often get on any one piece of playground. So this is where the natural environment, not a new tree, it's an old tree, can really help. So children don't need that. And I love this picture. Here's a little boy looking down a grate, a water grate. Now, what's happening down there? Has he just dropped a coin or a stone and he's listening to hear if there's water? Is he wondering if there's a monster down there that's about to come out and get him? Can he see that there's water? I don't know. What's he doing? He's using his imagination, no doubt. This isn't designed for playing, but this is what children will do. They will play with all the elements in the landscape. Okay. Another are neighbourhood spaces, are playing fields and sports pitches. And again, sometimes in the UK these are sometimes in parks, sometimes in schools, sometimes you have a whole set of playing pitches. So like the university has pitches, they tend to be synthetic grass now, unfortunately, when they're sort of very specifically. And this is what they look like. They're a bit boring, I think, to look at. And you'll soon discover that I have a thing about playing fields, because I think they're used usually by a very small number of people. They're not used by everybody at all. So I wonder whether a pitch can be used for more than one sport. We lay out a football pitch, it's only used for football. Okay? And then that grass is just left unused. Because another thing is it's usually only used for a few hours. You can see I was working out how many hours in a week, and it's only used for 3 or 4 hours. That's not making sense, surely. Should there be greater access for women, for children, people from ethnic minority groups, disabled people? Because as we saw earlier in the benefits of open spaces, the sporting is predominantly done by males? Sorry, males. Why aren't women doing more active things, or is it that we're not including them purposely? Now, there are some sports where women do play more, but is it that we are actually, our parks and our playing fields are excluding other people by the way they're designed and managed, in that you can only play football